Well, thank you so much for having me. So, welcome to Inside the Update. Take this update statement. Imagine, if you will, that we have just executed the query, started our transaction. A lot's going to happen inside this update. So, when we talk about updates, we tend to think of them as one table at a time. But in reality, we could actually be modifying multiple tables at once. Sometimes we can build it into our database design, and sometimes we can write those explicitly into our code. So let's take a look at a couple ways that we do this. Let's start with our cascading foreign keys. So when we create a foreign key, we can define actions that occur on the referencing columns whenever there is a change to the referenced column. So we can set the value to null, we can set it to a default, or we can cascade the action, which means setting it to be the same as the referencing or the referenced column. And we don't have to do anything about this. This gets done when we do the update to the parent table or the referenced column. But we can't see this in our execution plan. So here we can see that we're updating our table, and we can see that the child table or the referencing column is being modified based on the action that we defined in our foreign key. In this case, it happens to be a cascade on update. So we're setting the value to be the same as what it was in our parent table. Another way that we can do this is by using temporal tables. So temporal tables are system versioning. So we capture any time we do a change to the table. And this was a little easier to explain. We can look at our execution plans and we can see that when we make a change to our parent table, we take a copy of what the data was before we made the change and we insert it into our history table. Pretty clear. And again, modifying, changing data in two tables at the same time. We can also do this explicitly where we write it into our code. The first way we do this is through our output into clause. So when we first learn how to write update statements, we say you can only update one table at a time. This is how we know that is so not the case. So we have our update statement. And the cool thing about our update statement is right now we have access to the data as it existed before the change in our internal deleted table and as it will exist after the transaction is committed in our internal inserted table. And we have access to those right now in the middle of our update statement, which is actually pretty cool if you think about it. So what we can do with our output into clause is we can take that data and insert it into yet another table. It's pretty cool. And another way that we can programmatically explicitly say we're going to modify multiple tables at once is through our friend the trigger. Wait, scratch that. Our frenemy the trigger. Because let's face it, we kind of have a love-hate relationship with triggers. So as a reminder, what is a trigger? Those are those special stored procedures that are attached to a table that fire whenever the action we say needs to fire for. So for example, we're going to fire this stored procedure whenever we do an update. Now, what's happening in this case is our table is updated, and then everything that is in the stored procedure, everything that's in the trigger is going to be executed. The key thing to remember is that all of this is happening under that update statement, or more importantly, the transaction of that update statement. Everything has to complete successfully, otherwise everything fails. That initial update also fails. But it also means that however long it takes to do whatever is in that trigger to do, that's also part of your transaction, and that's how long that update statement is going to take. And of course, not just we have the instead of trigger. So it's not just after the update occurs, we can define our trigger to fire instead of our update. Again, it's still part of that transaction. We're still taking all of those locks for that update statement. But instead of that update statement actually occurring, we're only doing the action defined in our trigger. And if you didn't know that you had a trigger, or more importantly, that it's an instead of trigger, you may be a little bit surprised when you look at the data afterwards. So at this point, some of you may be asking, so Deborah, why are you telling us all of this? I've worked with triggers for years. I've worked with foreign keys for years. Nothing really is new about this. This seems kind of basic. What's the point? Well, I would argue that is the point. Because I think we often take the simplicity of updates for granted because we're just looking at that update statement. But we forget that there's a lot that's going on behind the scenes. So, a couple things that can be occurring. We may have to do index updates. There could be statistics that have to be updated. We may have constraint validations, not just for foreign keys either. And depending on your isolation level, there could be row versioning. So there's a whole lot of things we need to keep track of and make updates to in addition to just that update statement. And it's not just that one table that's being updated, it's all those tables that are being affected. And who here thinks we're talking about one record? This is SQL Server. We're dealing with record sets. So it could be 1, 10, 100, 1,000, a million records that are being updated all at once. And this is what we're asking SQL Server to keep track of. That's a lot of work that we're trying to accomplish in as short of time period as possible. I'll throw another idea out there for you. It's not just you, because how many of you are working in production as the only person as part of that database? The likelihood is you aren't. So now we introduce the idea of what are other people doing? And maybe they're trying to do the same things as you. So now we start introducing the ideas of locking and blocking. Everyone's waiting for all of those transactions to finish so their transaction and their work can be done. And think about all of these things. These are all transactions. We got to do something with those transactions. They have to be written somewhere, right? We have those transaction log rights. And so now we have to think about how do we size our transaction logs? Even if you're doing something like simple recovery, that's still a transaction that has to be written and keep track of by SQL Server. So now is our file growth set right for those transaction logs? Again, we're starting to see an exponential growth in what we're doing and what we're asking SQL Server to do during this one transaction because of all these other changes that are taking place. And who here thinks that we stop with just once that transaction's committed? There's still stuff that may need to happen because there are certain functionalities that SQL Server uses that are based on the transaction logs. So it reads the transaction logs, finds things that need to be applied elsewhere, and does something with it. This includes things like change data capture, replication. I'll even throw in availability groups because we're taking those transaction logs and applying them somewhere. So somehow our update is no longer about that single table and how that table is related to others. It gets into how data is moved and changed throughout our entire database. And in fact, our entire database ecosystem. And if you think about it, how your data changes, how it grows, how we modify things isn't just about your ecosystem, but it's about things that may consume that data down the road. And how does that data grow and how are we handling it? Are we prepared to handle it? So it's really important to think about what we're using and how we're using our data and throughout our entire database ecosystem. Because in the end, we don't want to have to think about all of this. That's a lot. We want to go back to think about our original update statement, like the one that started when I began talking. That's been running for quite a while now. But just stop and think. Think of all the different topics that we've covered in this time. As I said, a lot was going to happen during this update statement. So now our transaction has completed successfully, our statement is done, our update's done, and I just want to thank you all so much for coming. Thanks for listening. Giving you a little something to think about and hope you're enjoying Data Minutes today. Thank you all so much for having me.